Ich habe nämlich jetzt die große Freude, einen sehr besonderen Gast ankündigen zu dürfen. Professor Branko Milanović ist Professor an der City University of New York und einer der zentralen Experten, wenn es um das Thema Einkommensunterschiede und ihre Ursachen aus der globalen Perspektive herausgeht. Er war fast 20 Jahre lang leitender Ökonom in der Forschungsabteilung der Weltbank. 2017 erschien in Deutschland sein Buch Haben und nicht haben, eine kurze Geschichte der Ungleichheit, die vermutlich gar nicht so kurz ist. Und dafür wurde er auch mit dem Hans-Marthöfer-Preis für Wirtschaftspublizistik der Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung ausgezeichnet. Für alle diejenigen, der Vortrag wird jetzt gleich, Sie dürfen sich schon mal ganz langsam auf den Weg zur Bühne machen. Und für alle diejenigen, die gerne eine Übersetzung brauchen und noch kein Übersetzungsgerät haben, draußen liegen noch Übersetzungsgeräte, also dann machen Sie sich schnell auf den Weg oder geben vielleicht auch einfach ein Handzeichen. Vielleicht kommt dann auch wie durch ein Wunder ein Übersetzungsgerät auch noch zu Ihnen. A warm welcome, Branko Milanović. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Branko Milanović wird einen kurzen Rückblick, einen historischen Rückblick auf die Fragen von Verteilung und Ungleichheit geben und wir werden anschließend auch noch im Panel miteinander diskutieren. After your speech we will talk together in the panel so we can focus. Oh, okay. So I can speak German. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Wir haben jetzt ungefähr 30 Minuten Vortrag und dann noch gemeinsame Panel-Diskussion. Wie gesagt, brauchen Sie eine Übersetzung, dann holen Sie sich noch schnell eine und the stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Well, it was, of course, a pleasure and an honor to be here. I've come relatively recently to Berlin, and I've been actually at some of the trade union conferences before, including in Frankfurt, I think just before COVID. So I'm very happy, actually, that at least we are over with COVID and that we can resume normal life. Let me just take... Okay. So I will be speaking, as the previous speaker and the lady who introduced me, I will be speaking about global issues. And I think it's actually an interesting contrast between what we see at the German level, and the previous presentation, of course, explained that very much up to date, because these are the results of the survey that was just done on poverty. And I will speak about global level, and actually I would start, let me see if it works, I would start with actually historical perspective. The historical perspective will be very short, but I want to give you a little bit of a background about how global inequality has evolved. Before I do so, let me mention that global inequality in income means inequality in household per capita income. I have heard here that the term, for example, during the previous presentation of a poverty line in Germany, in this particular study, of 1,200. I suppose it is, I guess it is actually for a household divided and over the months. But in the cases, of course, of global inequality, what we do, we use household surveys from many countries. We get the numbers on income for households. These numbers come in local currency. We divide that number by the number of people who live in a household. So let's suppose you have 400 units of something and you have 4 members. Then each member is sort of assigned 100 units of that currency. And then we convert all of these currencies into something which is called purchasing power parity dollar, which in principle has the same purchasing power in India and the United States and Germany and Norway and elsewhere. I have to mention this technical issue because many times people say, well, you're comparing different countries with different price levels. We adjust for that. So in other words, in principle, the incomes are all commeasurable. Okay, so let's go back in a very short historical excursion. How did global inequality look over the last 2 centuries? We begin with the work from 1820s. It is based on the work, as you can see, by François Bourguignon and Christian Morisson that I recently updated. And this is the blue line, which is based on different types of estimates because we didn't have neither fiscal nor household survey data, obviously in the 19th century. The main point there is to realize on the vertical axis is the Gini coefficient, which is the measure of inequality, which goes from 0 to 100. The main point is to realize that just after Napoleonic Wars, global inequality had the level of Gini of 50, which is not so high for the world. It's high for individual countries, like, for example, countries like Colombia today have a Gini of over 50. But then you notice that rapid increase throughout the 19th century. And I will show you in the next graph what is driving that rapid increase. It's basically that rich countries of Europe, countries of Europe and North America and later Japan become much richer than India and China. China actually even declines in real terms. Now, the period between 1945 and approximately the end of the 20th century is, you notice there, is a period of extremely high inequality and unchanging inequality. Now, to many of you, it will come as a surprise because it was the period of what is called in the West the Great Compression. It was a period also of communist revolutions that significantly reduced inequality. And it is all true, but the gaps between the nations remained extremely high, and this is the world of the 3 worlds. The first world of capitalist, rich capitalist economy, the second world of socialist economies that were less rich, and the third world of basically Asia and Africa, and to some extent Latin America. Finally, notice what happens at the end, which means in our current period, significant decline in global inequality, essentially driven by China. Now, other Asian countries contributed to that as well, but we will talk about that in a moment. So when you then break this into the 2 components of global inequality, the blue one, which is the component due to the differences in between the countries, in income per capita between the countries, obviously, and that would appeal very much and very clear in countries like Germany and in Europe in general. The blue component adds all the differences between, let's suppose, Germany and Slovakia, Germany and France, Germany and the Middle Eastern countries, Algeria or Syria or whatever. So with all the countries. And the red component is inequality, the summation of inequalities within countries. Now, I will not go into great detail on that, although historically and politically it's a very important graph. You notice in the 19th century, both inequalities between the countries, the blue bar, go up, and inequalities within nation states go up. So you basically have the era of colonialism and globalization and of class troubles domestically. Then in the second period, with very high global inequality, the blue bar remains very high, and you notice inequalities like on this graph, it's not in Gini's, but it's 70 Gini point, which is extremely high. And the red bar in that period shrinks because that was the time of the Great Compression, as I mentioned. Now, let's look at the present. The red bar is increasing because inequalities in most countries, as you know well, and it was discussed previously, including Germany, UK, US, China, Russia, South Africa, for example, one of the most unequal countries, became even more unequal over the last 30 years. So actually, ironically, the fall of apartheid not led directly, but was associated with increased inequality in South Africa. And you see the red bar expanding. But the rise of China and Asia, and that's absolutely the key part of the story, reduces global inequality. It reduces it because many people, in the case of China, 1.4 billion people, become richer since they start very, very poor. So to have an intuition of that, imagine that all these people that we have seen in the previous presentation who were poor in Germany suddenly start moving through the middle class and become better off, and nobody falls behind. So clearly, that would reduce German inequality. The same thing happened at a global scale with the rise of Asia. So I really want to point out that the rise of Asia has been, and especially China, has been a globally equalizing event, which has significantly reduced global inequality. Now, the rise of Asia, you can display it in many different ways. I took here the well-known slide is about between the US and China. This is all done in PPP terms, and it's for the for the total economy of China and the US. You notice, of course, after the end of the World War II, in a somewhat paradoxical situation, US had more than the number 0.4 indicates 40% of global output. China had something like 2%. Well, nowadays the numbers are, of course, China is at about 20, I think it's 22%, US at the 15. So it's a major reversal. But there are many such reversals. Look at India versus Germany. You can look at the numbers there, but India is now producing 8% of the global GDP. Germany is producing 3%. So the bottom line, and I would like you to take this as a fact, I will show you more of things like this. There is, globally speaking, significant slide in the relative position of Europe. It's a significant slide also in the case of the United States, but Europe is, in some sense, more interesting because it is quite widespread. Now, what did it mean for global income distribution? It became the thick line in 2018, based on individual data. It became, as you can see, a sort of, it looks more like general income distributions within countries. As you noticed, it is more symmetrical than it was in 1988, and there are simply more people in the middle. And these people in the middle are mostly people from Asian countries. However, I don't want to overestimate and exaggerate that kind of so-called the creation of the global median class, because by European standards, these are still very poor people who have incomes of, $5, $6, $7, or $8 per capita per day. So from the German perspective, the global middle class or the global median class is still quite poor, and they would be probably considered as poor in the study that you have just heard before. And also, I don't want to overlook the huge gaps that exist, especially between Africa and the rest of the world. So even for adjusting for PPPs, you see the ratio in median incomes between Africa and the core countries, which are basically Western countries, rich countries, is 12.5 times. So that has huge implications for migration, which I will not speak today, but simply to give you an idea, if a Moroccan from the 80th percentile of the income distribution in Morocco decides to go to France and goes to the 20th percentile of the French income distribution, so relatively speaking, he has really gone down very significantly, his real income would increase by several times. So in other words, the issue of poor countries remains very much on the table, and the reflection of their poverty is oftentimes seen in migration, which in my opinion has a very strong economic component. Now, people have said, okay, how do you know migration has an economic component? Obviously, there are other components. There is a war, there are also religious persecution and so on. But we should only think actually in Europe of what led Europeans to emigrate. What led them was, generally speaking, economic conditions. So that's why many of them went to North America, went to South America. Some of them went because of war and persecution, but the bulk went for economic reasons. So how did then the world change during this period of 30 years of globalization? In the first period of high globalization, this is the work jointly done with the German economist Christoph Lachner. And maybe many of you have seen this graph. This is so-called elephant chart. And there are three important points there. people are on a horizontal axis ranked by their position in the global income distribution from 1, which is the lowest, to 100, which is the highest, and on the vertical axis by the cumulative increase in real incomes over these 20 years. Now, what is clear is that the people who are in the middle, most of them from Asian countries, have had actually significant increase in real income. That's people at point A. People at point B, who are lower middle class and lower middle class in rich countries, have had almost no real growth. And people at C, who are basically the top 1% globally, have had a very significant growth. Now, the political implications of that are well known. You have heard them. People use it for Trump, Brexit, AFD, you just name it, because politically this graph charts you 2 possible evolutions. If you want to improve the position of the people at B, and for example, let's suppose people in B, in Germany, you want to improve their position, well, there are 2 ways politically to do it. And that actually, to some extent, replicates or shows what are the political options on offer today. One, you say, okay, something was wrong with globalization. We don't like it this way, that Asia is doing much better than us. And then let's do something with lowering A and then increasing B. Well, the other possibility is you say, okay, I want to make domestic policy changes. I want to lower C and increase B. So in a nutshell, I will not go over that. This graph has been discussed and over-discussed, but this is really a basically political choice that, remains to be that can be made, given that the position of B, which is, as I said, lower and middle classes of Western countries, has not improved in real terms sufficiently, or maybe in some cases stayed where it was. Now, the situation really was not the same after the financial crisis. You know, the 2 essential, this is the same idea of a graph. Horizontal axis is the position in global income distribution. Vertical axis is the real growth. Asia continued growing. You know, people have been blinded by talking about global financial crisis. Very often whatever happens in the West, they just call it global. But it was not a global. You know, China and India continued growing at very high rates of growth. China grew at 10% throughout the whole period, and that shows you actually in the middle. And not only that, as you will see in a minute, the people from Asia start moving towards higher parts of the income distribution. The middle classes in the West stayed about the same as before, but the top of the global top 1% did not have such a good time after the financial crisis. It took them a long time to recover, and they never recovered high growth rates that they had before. And that continued for the next 5 years, same story, so I will skip that just to give you finally the conclusion. So this is the elephant, and this is actually what happened in the following 10 years. So we have essentially a change in the next 10 years before COVID. We have continued high growth among relatively poor people and middle-income people in the world, and actually no change among the middle classes of the West, and significant lower growth at the global top 1%. If there is a question later about global top 1%, I will be happy to answer. It gets a little bit complicated, so I'm not going to give all the details why actually the global top 1% did not have such a great period. However, if you translate the same numbers from relative terms into absolute terms, then the situation looks a little bit different, because the gap towards the top is so huge that even if the global top 1% has a small increase in percentage terms, in absolute terms, as you can see here, they gain a lot. So in other words, what I want to say, if the top 1% has incomes of $500,000 per capita per year, even a small increase of 1% is a significant increase for, compared to what the middle class and poor people will get over the same period. So the absolute numbers tell you somewhat different story from the relative numbers. So I will skip to what happened at the bottom of the global income distribution because it's essentially driven by the fact that China has evacuated all the people who were in the bottom of the global income distribution and moved them a little bit above the 20th percentile. But the interesting part here is what happened to the middle of the global income distribution. And that, I think, is the most interesting part. And here we have what I call the greatest reshuffle of individual incomes since the Industrial Revolution. What happened is the following. Now, look at the urban China. That's 800 million people. They're on the horizontal axis, urban decile. First decile, the poorest 10% of the urban China, the second, and so forth. And then vertical axis, that's quite important. Their position in the global income distribution. So look first at the blue line, which is the line for 1988, and look at the top Chinese urban decile. Well, that decile is at the 65th percentile of the world, okay? So they are better off than 2/3 of the world, worse off than 1/3. What happens 30 years later? What happens then is obviously they would all go up because China has grown tremendously. So everybody goes up, and as you can see, the top decile in urban China now is at the 96th percentile of the world. Okay, everybody knows that. That's kind of clear. China has done really well. They had to go up. But what is the implication? If parts of the Chinese and other Asian countries' distributions go up, somebody has to go down. This is ordinal ranking. It doesn't mean that somebody else has lost real income, but in ranking, that somebody else has to go down. Look at Italy. Italy, again, is the blue line in 1988, the red line 2018. Look at what happened to the bottom of the Italian income distribution. It simply plummets. Why does it plummet? Why does the lowest decile of Italy move from the 70th percentile or something to the 55th percentile? Because they are overtaken by people in Asia whose incomes have grown much faster. So, and there are lots of people like that, so they're not overtaken by 5 people, they're overtaken by 50 million people. And then, or in some cases, 100 million people. And then they go down very quickly in the global order. Now, that same story is true for all Western countries. This is Germany. It is less dramatic than Italy, but the bottom of the German income distribution has also globally lost its position. The top of the income distribution has not. Actually, there is even an improvement because the China effect has not gone that far in the income distribution. Look at Poland, which is the great success case of transition. People at the lower part of the Polish income distribution have also lost their global position. People at the top have improved. It might seem counterintuitive to you until you start thinking that Polish workers who were actually at the bottom, lower part, not the bottom, but lower part of the Polish income distribution, were better off, globally speaking, in terms of rankings, under Jaruzelski than they are today. It is because we forget what happened in the meantime. What happened in the meantime is that Asia, in grand masses of population, has moved into that area, and Poland, despite having been the only European country without recession since 1992, has actually, in that part of the income distribution, declined. And then, of course, that continues for every country. The same story is true for the United States. Notice the bottom 3 deciles for the United States also going down. Notice interesting thing for countries like Brazil. The China effect in Brazil is noticeable in the middle because the very poorest people in Brazil, they were poor anyway, whether China grows or not. They're still at the bottom of the global income distribution. And the very rich people in Brazil, they are still rich regardless of whether China grows or not, because they are beyond that, the China effect. They are actually in the global top 1%. So this is really the same story here is for Mexico. You also notice that the impact is especially strong in the middle of the income distribution. You see Mexico and Brazil have very similar impact of China in the same way that Western European or European Union has a very similar effect, but on a different part of the income distribution. So what then, what can we say for the present? I didn't keep the slide here, just want to say in one word, that particular effect of China is not noticeable at the global top. Not only top 1%, but global top 5%. The global tops remain very heavily populated by rich countries, including Germany, which represents about 5% of the population in the global 5%. The US alone represents 40% of the population in the global top 1%. Why is the US so overrepresented? Because it's a rich country, it has high population, and it's very unequal. So you have quite a lot of people at very high income brackets in the United States. So the top 1% essentially remains, let's call it Western dominated, but with changes, China now has 5% of people in the global top 5%, about the same number as Germany. India is still lower at only at 1.5% of people there. So what was now for the future? First, we have the shock of COVID, which still is kind of lingering, but had, of course, dramatic effect on growth rates on many countries. Then we have the second shock was the US-China relations that we all know, and which in the meantime, since I originally wrote these slides, deteriorated even further with possibly significant or dramatic effects both on Chinese and American economies and on income distributions within China and the US. And finally, we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, which of course not only has a tremendously negative impact on Ukrainian economy, but has a bad impact on Russian economy, and has, most importantly, very bad impact on the rest of the world, as you know in Germany quite well, through increase in fuel and food prices. As you know, fuel and food and transportation represent 80% of the budget of middle class and poorer families, so it really affects disproportionately people in lower income brackets. And that's true throughout the world. And the final, well, I didn't even have to write here the Gaza war now, which also we have no idea what will be the effects of that war. Obviously, if the war remains localized, it will be an effect in the Middle East. Incidentally, I want to mention that the gap in income between Israel and Gaza is one of the largest gaps in income in the world. We have Palestinian data, and we have Israeli data, and the gap is really like North and South Korea. So this is actually, I think, the second or even the first largest gap in the world between the two contiguous areas. And then finally, what can we then really project? What can we say about global inequality then in the more secular forces? The three problems that I mentioned, the three big issues, the COVID, US-China relations, Russia's war against Ukraine, are problems that are not, how should I say, do not allow forecasts to be made, because you don't know, maybe this war will stop, maybe the war will continue, maybe there'll be nuclear war, so how can you make a forecast? However, let's go to the long-term forces. And the long-term forces is that China is no longer the engine of global inequality reduction because it has become sufficiently rich, and the distances between China and countries in Africa especially are increasing. So that means that our attention should shift to India and Africa. And I think I highlight again Africa because this is the declining China effect, so I will skip that. At the very end, you see at the last period, China really has no effect on global inequality anymore, simply because, as I said, it has become sufficiently poor not to have this effect. Now, what the global effect, what the sort of global projection one could make is that the Western countries will, for the first time in 2 centuries, not become so preponderant or fully representative in the global quintile because of the rise of Asia. So it's really just a, how should I say, a trivial statement that Asia has become a sort of much more powerful economically. But when you translate that statement about GDPs into people's incomes, because if GDPs go up, they don't disappear in the air, they are actually reflected in people's incomes, that means that there is a major reshuffling in relative income positions between the West and the East. Then, of course, there is a geographical issue. I will not speak about that. But if the Western part, if Europe, European Union, and the Pacific coast of China already are richest part of Eurasia, the issue is actually that you would have in the middle a part with much lower income and much lower population density and everything else. So basically, if you can imagine a sort of Eurasian continent with two coasts, as being very rich. So the Eurasia would look very much like the United States looks today, you know, the two coasts being rich, and as people say, you just then fly from one coast to another, and the inland becomes kind of ignored. And then finally, my final slide and final question is, can Africa grow? And there I have to be very pessimistic. You know, for Africa to start converging, which means to start reducing differences between Africa and Europe in particular, implies growth rates of 5 to 6% per capita for, let's suppose, 20 years. No African country has achieved anything similar. You have here the list of countries that have achieved 5% annual growth for 5 years, and as you notice here, there is only one significant country, and it's Ethiopia. Nobody else. These are small countries which actually for 5 years they have increased price of cocoa or oil, and then they grow. And then you have 2 and 2.5% of population growth, and that's very important. So you have basically 7 to 8% required growth from Africa. Whether Africa would achieve that, I really don't know. I'm very sort of pessimistic, and it has a huge implication for Europe and for migration. And I again want to remind people who actually forget the historical precedents, but the gap in relative incomes between the northern and the southern shore of the Mediterranean has never been as high in history as it is now. If you go back to the Roman times, the differences in income were minimal. Actually, in many cases, of course, as you know, the Asia Minor was richer than Europe, is certainly richer than the UK, which was a really far away country. But even if you look later, the differences in income were much smaller, and they were actually probably about 1 to 1, or 1.5 to 1 maybe at the time of the Reformation and previously Renaissance and so on. But nowadays they are actually to the range of 10 to 1. The question is actually, can such differences in income be sustainable between the two continents that are close to each other and that are culturally similar, because we should not forget that, of course, many Africans, most Africans speak or have studied in French and English. So I will stop there. I would like simply to highlight that we are at the moment in history where dramatic changes happen politically, that dramatic economic changes had happened and will continue happening, that the center of gravity of the economic development has moved east very significantly, and that it has important implications on relative positions of population in the world. So these are these changes that you might not see every day, and particularly if you look at Germany alone, you might compare your position to Germany, to other German citizens as only, but in reality, you do eventually end up by comparing your position to the rest of the world, simply because you meet people, simply because you travel, simply because certain goods like going to the World Cup in Qatar will become beyond the possibility of the middle class to afford. So thank you very much. I hope I stayed within more or less my time, but it was a big topic. Thanks very much. Thank you all.